And welcome to the final presentation in the medical evidence part of this conference, which is really the heart of the conference. We're pleased to have a very distinguished speaker, but first let me tell you how things are going to work over the next 2 to 3 weeks. Next week, we've got Doug Horn returning to talk about the national security state and the Kennedy assassination, which is the title of this conference. That will be followed the following week by me on the same subject. And then we've decided to add a panel discussion the week following that that'll focus only on the national security state. Since we've covered the medical evidence and the autopsy pretty thoroughly, especially in the Q&A, we decided that we don't need any more Q&A on that, but we thought it'd be a good idea to have one final panel of Q&A of the speakers that before the medical evidence and after the medical evidence on the national security state. So plan for that. And so let's go right into our presentation. I want to introduce to you Dr. Gary Aguilar. He is a practicing ophthalmologist in California, clinical professor of ophthalmology at the University of California in San Francisco. He's been researching the Kennedy assassination for at least 20 years. He's one of the few people who have been permitted to examine the actual autopsy materials in the National Archives. He's widely published both in scientific journals and the popular press. He's a popular speaker at JFK conferences. In fact, any conference that I attend, if he's speaking there, I always make it a point to go listen to him. And several years ago, he wrote this absolutely fantastic article on the 5 official investigations into the medical evidence in the autopsy. They were conducted by the U.S. government. And that article had such a big impact on me that my second book, I wrote my first book on the Kennedy assassination, the Kennedy Autopsy, and then I followed that up with a sequel called the Kennedy Autopsy 2, and it revolved in large part around Gary's investigation of those 5, analysis of those 5 investigations. So I highly recommend that article. I'm sure he's going to reference it tonight because that's the title of his talk. So without any further ado, thank you, Gary, for taking the time to join us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and thank you very much, Bart, for the help. And I'm sorry about the glitchiness. Scheduling issues have been complicated. I had a very busy surgery day today, but I want to welcome everyone, and I want to welcome everyone's interest and thank people for coming and being online here with us today. I'm going to be talking about something which is near and dear to my heart. That's the medical and autopsy evidence in the Kennedy case. And as Jacob mentioned, I'm going to start here with these slides. Come on in. And I want to bring everyone's attention to this. Let me just see if I can get this slideshow to.
Yeah, Gary, hit slideshow on the top there.
Slideshow, I think. Unfortunately, it's being blocked by this is the Zoom icons. Let's see if we can get. Oh, here's an idea. Okay, slides. Let's see if I can get slideshow up. Pardon. Excuse me, everyone. From current slide. There we go. All right. Here we are. I hope that that's visible to everyone there. In any case, for anyone who is interested in this, and speaking of the national security state, it's very evident to me that the national security state had great concern about Kennedy's assassination. Perhaps I think because our federal officials may have had something to do with it. They certainly had something to do with trying to cover it up afterward. And people who have looked at the medical and autopsy evidence say, well, gosh, there's been 5 investigations into Kennedy's medical and autopsy evidence, and they've been performed by people who have wonderful credentials, and they've all concluded that shots came from above and behind where Oswald was supposed to have been. Why shouldn't we trust them? In any case, let's get a little bit of background here. First, JFK was murdered in Dallas. He was then flown to the Naval Hospital in Bethesda, where 3 professor pathologists performed an autopsy. Now, by professor pathologists, what I mean is that these are guys that have are fully credentialed and teach younger pathologists how to do an autopsy. So they had a lot of experience for general autopsies, and that they concluded that Oswald, or at least they concluded that JFK was shot from above and behind, where everybody agrees Lee Harvey Oswald had fired at the president. Pretty open and shut case on the basis of the medical evidence. Or is it? Let's ask. Warren Commission attorney Arlen Specter, in a U.S. News and World Report interview, said there's every reason to believe that we did get a comprehensive, thorough professional autopsy report from trained, skilled experts. And their conclusion, 2 shots from the rear. So the question arises for anybody that's reasonable and curious about this: why should we doubt it? Wasn't the full majesty of the state put in service of solving the crime of the century? Would unimpeachable icons such as Chief Justice of the United States Earl Warren, CIA head Allen Dulles, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, and the President of the United States then, LBJ, have settled for anything less than the full truth? And weren't absolutely indisputable facts extracted during the president's post-mortem examination that proved the essential fact that there was but one assassin, and he shot at Kennedy from above and behind, killing him. So, and of course you have original autopsy notes, autopsy photographs and x-rays, and 3 independent teams of forensic authorities, all of impeccable reputation, have second sole assassin conclusion. And in all, essentially 4 expert panels reaffirmed that Kennedy fell to a lone gunman that was firing at him, or that fired at him from above behind. So it's reasonable to ask, were all these leaders and independent medical experts mistaken or corrupt or part of a conspiracy? Reason for doubt came from good sources, not least of which was a former chief coroner in New York City, Michael Baden. He chaired the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Forensics, Reexamination, which also, by the way, as we'll see, concluded that Kennedy was shot from above and behind, and so Oswald was likely guilty. But he reviewed the autopsy as it was originally done, and he said, where bungled autopsies are concerned, President Kennedy is the exemplar. And for reasons that we'll see, that anyone watching today will understand, it really was a bungled autopsy. So, but again, people will always hasten to add that even though there are a lot of mistakes made, that independent people have re-examined this, and they've all come to the same conclusion, a conclusion that has withstood the test of time. And the experts include the original Warren Commission doctors and physicians, professor pathologists, if it will, another group that was brought in, the so-called Clark panel, which we'll discuss today. The third group, a so-called independent group of physicians, was organized during the Rockefeller Commission's investigation. And then finally, in 1978 and 79, the House Select Committee on Assassinations assembled a panel of forensic physicians. And there was also sort of some independent United States Justice Department authorities. In any case, let's understand something, because it's important that everyone realizes that whenever anyone is involved in a complex human endeavor, whether you're writing, studying physics, chemistry, writing history, doing anthropology, there are going to be errors. Errors occur, and one can expect that errors will fall sometimes one way and fall sometimes the other way. There are a remarkable degree of errors and a remarkable number, a myriad of errors that were made by the original autopsy team and by the experts who officially reinvestigated John Kennedy's medical and autopsy evidence. And the fascinating thing is that there are errors always uniformly go but a single way in support of the government's conclusion that Oswald did it. Of course, he who pays the fiddler. Who's paid for these reinvestigations? The government. Whose conclusions are they buttress? The government's. In any case, let's go through just to get a general idea of of Jack Kennedy's wounds and what we're talking about here, so we can discuss what happened when they were reinvestigated. They concluded that 2 bullets struck JFK. Both were fired from above and behind him. The first one struck JFK in the upper back, exited Kennedy's throat, went forward to inflict all the wounds. There were a number of wounds suffered by John Connally, who was sitting in front of JFK. The same bullet then is supposed to have exited from John Connally's body after it went through him. It then entered the backside of his forearm and wrist, exited through the molar surface, or the surface facing his palm, and finally a fragment of the bullet ended up in Governor Connally's left thigh. That's the first bullet, the so-called magic bullet. There's lots to say about the magic bullet, and I've written quite a bit about it. Suffice it to say that the bullet that was found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital, they said, was this magic bullet that went through both Jack Kennedy and Governor Connally. That bullet is not the bullet that we have in evidence today. It was a different bullet, and you can just Google up magic bullet and my name, and I'll take you to all the declassified documents and original interviews about that. But nevertheless, that was the idea that 2 bullets struck from above and behind, one hit Kennedy in the upper back and caused damage to his upper part of his chest, which we'll learn, and it went through Governor Connally. And this is a diagram of the single bullet, and to try to explain the theory that Kennedy was sitting behind the governor. The bullet went through him and then went through the governor, as you can see as per this diagram. And on the right side, you can see the bullet that's supposed to have done all that. It's called Commission Exhibit 399. It's present at the National Archives. I've seen the original. And here is a so-called Rydberg diagram showing how that bullet passed through Kennedy. And you can see the bullet hole from an original autopsy photograph. Now, I've seen the original autopsy photographs, which are of much higher quality than this black and white one. But listeners and viewers should know this is a real autopsy photograph. They're bootleg copies. Again, not quite as good as the originals, but it's the real deal. And this is the bullet that's supposed to have done that. It was supposed to have been found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital on the afternoon of the assassination. And again, it is this bullet with very little deformation. As you can see, the only little deformation is slight flattening at the base here. That's supposed to have caused all 7 non-fatal injuries in both JFK and Connally. Went through Kennedy this way, right through this, and then of course went through John Connally. The second bullet, the fatal bullet, has 2 official paths. The Warren Commission and the original autopsy doctor said that the bullet entered low toward the base of Jack Kennedy's skull and exited out toward the right side, as you can see as per this diagram. But when subsequent people went back and looked at the original autopsy photographs and x-rays, they decided that the autopsy doctors had gotten it. So imagine this. This is where this is something called the external occipital protuberance. I'm circling around that there. That's that little knob at the base of your skull. And the original autopsy doctor said that the bullet went in close to this, to the right and just above, and you'll see other diagrams, but about here, and it went forward. Later on, they said, no, that's not what happened. The bullet actually entered at a much higher place, and rather than being in occipital bone, and this bone down here is occipital bone, it went through a different bone, the parietal bone, 10 centimeters higher than the originally claimed entrance wound. And the first people that came up with that conclusion were the first group of doctors that looked at the autopsy evidence to review it, and that were the doctors at the Clark panel. Subsequently, doctors for the Rockefeller Commission and the House Select Committee all agreed the bullet entered high like this and not low. And this diagram, by the way, on the right is a diagram that was published by the House Select Committee on Assassination by the Forensics Panel of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Now, gunshot autopsies are a real specialty. The kind of subspecialty that does a gunshot autopsy or one of violent deaths, knife wounds, gunshots, that sort of thing, is a forensic pathologist. He's not an anatomic or a general pathologist. General pathologists, like the ones that greeted Kennedy when he was rolled into the Navy morgue, are experts in natural death, things like heart attacks, strokes, cancer, that kind of thing. Not gunshot deaths, not knife wounds. To get that kind of expertise requires additional years of training and lots of experience. But anatomic pathologists that are interested in that will continue to pursue that, and usually under the tutelage of other forensic pathologists around the country. Jack Kennedy's chief autopsy surgeon was a general pathologist. His name was Commander Humes, and his second in command was J. Thornton Boswell, also an anatomic pathologist. 30 minutes after the autopsy had begun, forensic pathologist from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, a fellow named Colonel Pierre Fink, came in. But by that time, Humes and Boswell had already removed JFK's brain, and forensically important evidence may very well have been lost by then. Unfortunately, Fink was not the guy that should have been his autopsy. And you'll notice that everyone that's involved in the autopsy works for the government as in the military. There is no forensic pathologist in the world outside the government that would not have volunteered to do an autopsy. There were forensic pathologists down at Baltimore that had a lot of experience, and the autopsy doctors asked for permission to have them come in, and the permission was denied. They were refused permission to bring in outside pathologists. So they brought Fink over. Fink was a poor backup. Even though he was credentialed and had trained in it, he didn't do forensic autopsies. He basically reviewed the autopsies that were done by others. So one of the most famous forensic pathologists in the world, in New York City's Milton Halpern, described Dr. Fink's circumstances. And he said, Colonel Fink's position throughout the entire proceeding, that is Kennedy's autopsy, was extremely uncomfortable. If it had not been for him, the autopsy would not have been handled as well as it was. But he was in the role of a poor Army bastard child foisted into a Navy family reunion. He was the only one of the three doctors with any experience with bullet wounds. But you have to remember that his experience was limited primarily to reviewing files, pictures, and the records of finished cases. There's a world of difference between standing at an autopsy table and trying to decide whether a hole in the body is a wound of entrance or a wound of exit, of which there's great controversy, incidentally, and in reviewing another man's work at some later date in the relaxed academic atmosphere of a private office. Well, that's what Dr. Fink was. He was basically an armchair forensic pathologist, not a practicing forensic pathologist. And Kennedy's wounds needed a very astute, they were complex, they needed a very astute practicing forensic pathologist. In any case, go to something that I think is very telling in JFK's autopsy report, which you can read right here. In the report, it says 3 shots were heard, and the president fell forward, bleeding from the head. According to newspaper reports, Washington Post, and it lists it, this is right from the autopsy report, which you can find in the Warren report online. Bob Jackson, a Dallas Times Herald photographer, said he looked around as he heard the shots and saw a rifle barrel disappearing into a window on the upper floor of the nearby Texas School Depository building. Next, further, it says shots resounded in rapid succession. The president's hands moved to his neck. He appeared to stiffen momentarily and lurched slightly forward in his seat. A bullet had entered the back of his neck. Another bullet then struck President Kennedy in the rear portion of his head, causing a massive and fatal wound. The president fell to the left into Mrs. Kennedy's lap. That's what the autopsy pathologists heard. That's what was published in the press, that he was hit in the head, he fell forward, and then off to the left, and they put that into the autopsy report. So it's interesting that Kennedy's journalist reports became part of the evidence of Kennedy's assassination, just witness reports. Now, it's using credible background information from the scene of a murder is neither improper or unusual in autopsy examinations. But in JFK's case, the information turned out to be as inaccurate as it was likely influential in their conclusions. Now, We don't think he didn't fall to the left. And if you read the original handwritten autopsy report before they edited it slightly, it says 3 shots were heard and the president fell forward. Well, here's what you actually see in this Zapruder film. At the bottom left is Zapruder frame 312, literally 1/18 of a second before he's struck in the head. Then at 3:13, he's struck in the head and you see his head explode. And in 8 frames later, you can see that Kennedy has lurched backward. In less than half of a second, he is driven back and to his left. Well, that jolt back into his left is not only not mentioned in the autopsy report because they didn't hear about it, but in the Warren Commission's volumes, and of course the Warren Commission had a Zapruder film, in either the Warren report or the Warren Commission volumes, there is no mention of the most dramatic motion in the Zapruder film, and that's Kennedy being driven back to his left. Now, people looking at a film like that might say, hey, it looks like he might have been driven back to his left because he was hit from the right front and not from behind. It's nowhere mentioned in any of the Warren Commission's volumes, a remarkable omission. So the question is, the autopsy provides evidence, and the evidence that you base your conclusions on about what happened. And the question is the evidence complete? And we first learned in 1998 that under, and this is a quote from an AP dispatch, quoting something that happened during interviews that were conducted by the autopsy pathologist, that under oath that before the Assassination Records Review Board in 1997, Dr. Humes, JFK's chief pathologist, admitted under persistent questioning that differs from what he told the Warren Commission. He had destroyed both the notes taken at the autopsy and the first draft of the autopsy report. Humes told the Warren Commission that he'd burned a first draft of the autopsy protocol, but that he'd said nothing about destroying the original autopsy note he'd taken by hand on the night of the autopsy, or those taken by Dr. Fink. Now, Dr. Fink is the only forensic pathologist there. He apparently prepared notes. So did Dr. Humes prepare notes. Those notes have vanished. Now, I don't know if it's worth going into too much detail here, but suffice it to say, Dr. Fink was bitterly complaining about the fact that he looked around for his autopsy notes after the completion of the autopsy, and they disappeared. And there was a contact report published by the Assassination Records Review by a doctor who he spoke to about the fact that they disappeared. But the doctors themselves were very, very circumspect and very unhelpful, to say the least. They were called in, for example, to testify for the Assassination Review Board, Dr. Humes, Boswell, and Fink, and they initially said they didn't want to do so. So they finally only appeared when the Assassination Records Review Board threatened to slap subpoenas on them. In any case, Dr. Humes has explained several times that the reason he burned those original autopsy notes because he did not want them to become, because they were splattered with the president's blood, and they did not want them to become objects of morbid curiosity. But again, he didn't destroy all the autopsy notes. He preserved those of his assistant, J. Thornton Boswell. And as anyone can see right here, I've put in some little arrows pointing where they are. These are also spattered with the president's blood. So he said he destroyed the notes so that they wouldn't be seen spattered with the president's blood, because that would, only attract morbid curiosity. But he didn't destroy others' notes, those of his associate, J. Thornton Boswell. So what you have is a situation which is fascinating, and that is you have inexperienced pathologists who had been given misleading information, saying that Kennedy had been shot from above and behind, and he fell forward after the shots, that encouraged them to look to the rear to find the source of Kennedy's demise. Dr. Humes destroyed both original autopsy notes and the first draft of the autopsy report. And one can only wonder if the original pathologist's conclusions had been any different if they had heard the truth that Kennedy had violently rocked backward with a fatal shot, and that there were credible reports that the shots had been fired from both the front and the rear. In any case, one of the things that you will find is that the Warren Commission and all subsequent investigations are continually shaping the narrative toward the lone gunman conclusion. There was a news conference conducted on the afternoon of the assassination, and the news conference was of the doctors who'd taken care of the president. including Dr. Malcolm Perry. And Dr. Perry was asked, where was the entrance wound? He was speaking about the throat wound, about the neck throat wound. And he said, well, there was an entrance wound in the neck. Asked again, which way was the bullet coming on the neck wound? At him? Perry, it appeared to be coming at him. Question, doctor, describe the entrance wound. You think from the front in the throat? Dr. Perry, the wound appeared to be an entrance wound in the front of the throat. Yes, that is correct. The exit wound, I don't know. It could have been the head, or there could have been a second wound to the head. There was no time to determine at this particular instant. Okay. The UPI then reported that there was the United Press International reported that there was an entrance wound below the Adam's apple. The New York Times reported that that Mr. Kennedy was hit by a bullet in the throat just below the Adam's apple. This wound had the appearance of a bullet's entry. The Dallas Morning News reported the front hole was described as an entrance wound, and it quoted Dr. Perry, quote, it did, however, appear to be the entrance wound at the front of the throat. These press accounts and others like them accurately reflect the fact that at no time during the press conference, and that press conference is available, you can read it yourself, did Dr. Perry allow for any other possibility than the throat wound was an entrance wound. Now, for reasons that I'm not going to go into here, he may not have been right about that. But it doesn't. But the point I'm trying to make here is how the Warren Commission shaped the narrative. He gives a press conference. At no time during the press conference does he say it was anything but an entrance wound, and it's reported widely across the country that that's what he said. How does the Warren report describe Dr. Perry's press conference statements? It reported Dr. Perry stated to the press a variety of possibilities that could account for the president's wounds, which is complete rubbish, of course. Shortly after that, Dr. Perry was asked, he was asked by Life magazine. So listen, if the president was shot from behind, how have an entrance wound in the throat, in the front? And Dr. Perry, still, hewing to the idea that there was an entrance wound in the front, answered. He said, well, look, it may have been the president was looking sideways with his head thrown back when the bullet struck him from behind. Life magazine had the Zapruder film. It owned the film. And in the December 18th, 1963 issue, Life magazine reported that JFK had turned his head toward the sniper's nest just before being shot. In other words, giving a justification for Perry's surmise that the reason there's an entrance wound in the throat is because Kennedy turned around. Well, as anyone who's ever seen the Zapruder film now knows, Kennedy never did that. He never turned around. Neither the Warren Commission, nor Life magazine, nor the government ever corrected this error that was published in Life magazine. But again, Life magazine, a major publishing outlet, read by millions of people, particularly right after the assassination, because it had a lot of information about the assassination. They were relying to essentially support the government's conclusion Oswald had shot from behind. And this is just one of many exhibits cited by skeptics that criticize the media's pro-government handling of Kennedy's murder. In any case, so when they're now under oath, Dr. Perry and all the doctors were being quizzed as to the nature of the wounds and the bullets that caused them. And Arlen Specter was pushing the idea of a single bullet had done all the damage, all the non-fatal damage to both the president and the governor. And he had to push this crazy magic bullet theory because they didn't have, the Zapruder film showed that there wasn't enough time for Oswald to have acquired his target, fired and acquired his target again and fired twice. Two bullets couldn't have created all the non-fatal injuries, so it must have been a single bullet. And so Arlen Specter asked Dr. Perry, based on the appearance of the neck wound alone, could it have been an either wound or an exit wound? And Dr. Perry answered, well, it could have been either. And then Specter launched into a question, and I won't read it in detail. It's coming on the next slide. But he says, well, permit me to supply some additional facts. And he alleges that they're facts. Of course, there's suppositions on his part, but he calls them facts. Dr. Perry, which I shall ask you to assume as being true for the purposes of having you express an opinion. And you can all go online and read the question, but he basically assumes all the elements that would have to be true for the single bullet theory to work. That the president was struck by a 6.5 millimeter copper jacketed bullet fired from a gun having a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,000 feet per second, with the weapon being approximately 160 to 250 feet from the president, with a bullet, yada, 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 right on that the bullet went through without violating the pleural cavity, but bruising the apex of the right pleural cavity, and then so on and so forth. And then after he lays down all these things as facts, although they're not facts at all, he then asked, he said, now, assuming those facts to be true, would the hole which you observed in the neck of the president be consistent with an exit wound under those circumstances? Dr. Prairie says, certainly would be consistent with an exit wound. Well, Arlen Specter wasn't satisfied by asking only Dr. Perry these questions. He literally posed that same question verbatim. And if you want to look up when it says 6H42, you can go to the volume 6 of the Warren Commission volumes, page 42, page 38, volume 3, page 362, and so on and so forth. These were all these other doctors who participated in Jack Kennedy's care were asked the same question, and to get the same answer that yes, the wound in the throat was consistent with an exit wound. That's how they were shaping the narrative. So then they had to deal with Governor Connolly and his wounds. And the Warren report on page 95 says, in their testimony, the three doctors who attended Governor Connolly at Parkland Hospital expressed independently their opinion that a single bullet had passed through his chest, tumbled through his wrist with very little exit velocity, leaving small metallic fragments from the rear portion of the bullet, punctured his left eye after the bullet had lost virtually all of its velocity and had fallen out of the thigh wound. That's part of the Warren report. So they basically say that all of the three doctors that attended him expressed independently their opinion that that's what happened. And that's Dr. Robert Shaw, Dr. Charles Gregory, Dr. George Shires. Those are the three doctors that attended the governor. All right. And that report in the Warren report accurately reflects what these three witnesses had said when they were first interviewed on March 23rd, 1964. But that was before they'd seen the Zapruder film, before they saw the Stretcher Bullet Commission exhibit the magic bullet, and before they saw other key physical evidence. But they testified again after they saw the Zapruder film, the magic bullet, and other evidence. And here's what they said. Dr. Shaw said, I feel there would be some difficulty in explaining all the wounds of both Kennedy and Connolly had sustained being inflicted by bullet exhibit 399 without causing more in the way of loss of substance to the bullet or deformation of the bullet. Dr. Gregory, sitting next to him, agreed. He says, I'm not persuaded by that this single bullet theory is very probable. 2 years later, Arlen Specter is still pushing this, and he writes, and in an interview in the U.S. News and World Report, he says all of the doctors who attended the governor thought that the same bullet had inflicted all the non-fatal wounds. That's how they were shaping the narrative. They quoted what they wanted people to believe to be true and just ignored what they had actually said and ignored their more informed opinion. So moving on to this. So the Warren Commission wanted to do some tests to see if the injuries the injuries that Kennedy sustained could be duplicated with some experimentation. And of course, that's what you ought to do. You ought to see, well, this is how they said it went down. The assassination went down. Let's try to duplicate this. And as it says, and you can find all the page numbers and the quotes and find it right online. These quotes are available on my original essay, which I made reference to at the beginning of the talk. An extensive series of tests were conducted by the wound ballistics branch of the U.S. Army at Edgewood Arsenal. These experiments, the Warren Commission said, blew out the right side of the test skull in a manner very similar to the head wounds of the president. So here is the skull, and that is Commission Exhibit 861. So there they are reporting that this skull had wounds very much like the president right here, and that is an actual autopsy photograph of JFK. As I said before, They're bootleg copies. They're not as high quality as originals that I have seen at the National Archives, but that's the real deal. And this is what happens if you had shot at President Kennedy the way the Warren Commission had concluded he had been shot, the way the autopsy doctors said he had been shot. The bullet would have entered in low here, and Kennedy's head, of course, they have Kennedy depicted bent way forward here, but had he been shot the way he actually was in position, it would have blown out his right orbit. Anybody who is a physician here that's watching this, you can see that the entire right orbit is missing, and part of the malar bone, the cheekbone is missing as well. That's what happens when you actually shoot in the manner in which. But here you have people testifying, and here we are. And he was describing, now this is their forensics expert, again, shaping the narrative, constantly shaping this. This is the national security state, basically defending the conclusions that they want the public to believe about how Kennedy died. And as he's describing this, Dr. Olivier, who had done these tests, this is the guy that did the test, he says, well, this particular study, this is a direct quote, you can read his testimony, volume 5 of the Warren Commission, page 89. This particular skull blew out the right side in a manner very similar to the wounds of the president. We found that this bullet could make the type of wound that the president received. Now, there's some evidence that some of the members of the Warren Commission looked at the autopsy photographs, but they all had this, because this is a published document. This is the Rydberg diagram. And in the Rydberg diagram and in the autopsy report, it makes no mention of loss of the orbit, no mention of loss of the lower part of the frontal bone or the cheekbone as this. And this is what the skulls that were shot in duplication experiments actually look like. They knew that Kennedy's face had not been destroyed by the bullet, and yet here you have an expert testifying that this bullet could make the type of wound that the president received. Now, when you review stuff that's been published recently, and that's Lucian Haig's work that was published in the Association of Firearms and Toolmark Examiners article, the guy that was featured on the PBS Nova show, Cold Case JFK, he's also quoting this, and that quote is virtually verbatim, also quoted by Lucian Haig. They don't care about what the duplication tests actually show. They just want to support the conclusion of the government's that Oswald had done it. And this is another quote based on information provided by. Now this is again to show you how they shape the narrative. So they talk about the Rydberg diagram, which was to depict how Kennedy was positioned at the moment he got that fatal shot, with his chin dipped downward. And he said, based on information provided by the doctors who conducted the autopsy, an artist's drawing depicted the path of the bullet through the president's head. And you can see that this is how the Warren Commission had the bullet going through the president's head, entering very low in the rear of the skull and coming out sort of toward the right side. Okay. And you can see this is the area that we could probably call that the external occipital protuberance at the base of the skull. But you'll notice something about the way they have Kennedy's head positioned, and this is how they depicted it. They had this Zapruder film. They could have depicted the tilting of his head any way they wanted. You also notice where the bullet hole here is actually original autopsy photographs. It's lower than that, but that's neither here nor there. They wanted that bullet to come out through his throat. So of course, in the Rydberg diagram, they have the back entrance wound at a high position. But you can also see the tilt of the head. Now, Kennedy's head was tilted forward and was tilted downward, but not nearly as far as they had to tilt the head in this to make this theory work. But had the bullet gone in low in the rear of Kennedy's head, and let's assume that this is approximately external occipital protuberance, it would have blown out through his orbit. Here's where his eye socket is, more or less. It would have looked something like this had the bullet gone the way it was supposed to have gone. And of course, they claim that this is in the same approximate position as the Zapruder frame 312. Well, there's a Zapruder frame 312, so you can compare for yourself. It's not an effort. This is tilted much more to make the theory work. But doubts about the conclusions began because of books that began being published in the mid 1960s and late 1960s. Harold Weisberg's book, Whitewash, Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment, Edward Epstein's Inquest, Life Magazine's Matter of Reasonable Doubt, and Richard Popkins' The Second Oswald. All these books came out and began raising questions. So the New York Times, Harrison Salisbury, wanted non-government pathologists to review the autopsy photographs and x-rays, and he got that request to Warren Commission counsel David Slauson. And this is something that the Kennedy attorney Burke Marshall had resisted. Salisbury's ultimate goal, the Warren Commission counsel Slauson worried, might be that the Times would endorse a wide-ranging reinvestigation of the whole assassination. Even though initially examined this, they were really afraid that if they started looking at this, that it might lead to a freewheeling examination. And so Slauson wrote that there's still a reasonable chance of spiking this thing, and that is a reinvestigation into the whole assassination by a reinvestigation limited to aspects of the autopsy. But if public opinion continues to develop as it has over the past few months, we may soon be faced with a politically unstoppable demand for a freewheeling reinvestigation of all aspects of the assassination. Well, that's what they wanted. So the Justice Department, with Attorney General Ramsey Clark's approval, quietly arranged, no one knew about this, it was done in secret originally, for the original autopsy team to conduct the first formal examination ever of JFK's autopsy photographs and x-rays. Now, that should be of interest to anyone watching this anyhow. When they did the autopsy, they had x-rays to look at there, but they never saw the autopsy photographs when they were autopsy report, nor did they ever see them. So there were two inspections of the original materials were conducted by the autopsy team, the first on November 1st, 1966, and the second on January 20th. That's the original autopsy doctors went in and looked at the autopsy x-rays and photographs. And they prepared two attestations saying that all the photographs are there, no photographs or x-rays are missing, and that the images support their original conclusions. Well, all right, so you ask a group to investigate itself, what do you expect? That's no surprise. So Dr. Boswell, and I'm having a little tough time reading this myself because it parts the screen. Dr. Boswell admitted that one of the attorneys for the Justice Department asked him to write a letter and request that apparently their personal attestations that, yeah, we got it right the first time and the autopsy photographs, x-rays prove we were right. That apparently wasn't satisfying a lot of people. So the Justice Department went back to Dr. Boswell, and he admitted this. He admitted this under oath. He said, yeah, they came to me and they said, well, we want you to write us a letter requesting a civilian group be appointed by the Justice Department or by the president or somebody. And I did write a letter asking for a re-examination by an independent group. And it led to the creation of the first semi-independent, and I'll say that advisedly because it was not all that independent, the Clark panel, named after Attorney General Ramsey Clark. But why did Ramsey Clark want another review? And I should probably reverse this. Let's go back to this. These two inspections were done. Two attestations were prepared declaring that no autopsy photographs were missing and that the images support the original autopsy conclusions. Well, here is their review, and you can read this over on the left, and I've blown it up on the right, and it's the same stuff that you see right here. The x-rays and photographs described and listed above include all the x-rays and photographs taken by us during the autopsy, and we have no reason to believe that that other photographs or x-rays were made during the autopsy. Okay. Well, so here is their attestation. Okay. They signed off on the fact that everything is complete, nothing was missing. All right. When you dug through the files, and I want to thank the Assassination Records Review Board for finding these documents, you find that a memo from Carl Belcher of the U.S. Justice Department. And he says that on the afternoon of November 10th, 1966, I took the original and one carbon copy of the document entitled Report of Inspection by Naval Medical Staff yada, 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 to Bethesda Hospital, where it was read and signed by Captain Humes, Dr. Boswell, Captain Ebersol, who was a radiologist that night, and the autopsy photographer, Mr. John Stringer. Certain incorrections were made in the document before they signed it. The significance of this is that these guys didn't write this attestation that all the autopsy x-rays and photographs are there. They weren't, that wasn't what they wrote. The Justice Department wrote this for them. As he said, I took the original and one carbon copy of the document, and he took the original to them and they signed it, okay? And you'll say that certain incorrections were made in the document before they signed it, okay? There's the document. There are the incorrections they made. This is available online. And again, that's they're saying that this includes all the materials. And the other thing you'll notice is you have Humes, Boswell, Ebersol, and Stringer in that order. And sure enough, Humes, Boswell, Ebersol, and Stringer is exactly the order in which Carl Belcher of the Justice Department indicates they signed it. That's what they prepared. These guys signed their attestation. Now, Pierre Fink was familiar with this document, and he said yes. Well, a statement had prepared by the Justice Department, and we signed the statement. There's the statement, okay, and where it was read and signed by Captain Humes, Dr. Boswell, Captain Ebersol, and Mr. John Stringer, just in that order. Okay. What's interesting is that even though they signed an attestation that there were no photographs missing, they later repeatedly testified under oath that photographs they took on the night of the autopsy were missing from the official inventory that they had signed off on as complete in this attestation in 1966, okay? Before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Andy Purdy reported that, quote, John Stringer, he was the autopsy photographer. He was in there taking photographs of Kennedy during the autopsy. He said that it was his recollection that all the photographs he had taken were not present in 1966 when Dr. Stringer saw the photographs for the first time. Stringer, noted that the receipt had said that some of the film holders, because they were duplex film holders, which is a kind of view camera they were using then, had no film on one side of the cassettes. He said the receipt said that this happened in 2 or 3 of the film holders where only one side was allegedly loaded. He said he could understand that the film holders were reported to have been poorly exposed or defective film, but he could not believe that there were any slides on the film holders which were not loaded with film. In other words, they basically accused him of not having film in the film holders. And John Stringer was a famous autopsy photographer, so famous that the government would send other autopsy photographers to him to learn how to do it. He was the man. And he said, I took some images, and those images that I took are missing. Dr. Humes testified. This is in his Warren Commission testimony. Dr. Humes says, this skull wound then had the characteristics of a wound of entrance from this direction through the tables, the 2 tables of the skull. In other words, he's talking about that entrance wound in the back of Kennedy's head. And incidentally, photographs illustrating this coning or beveling phenomenon that show the bullet's direction from both the internal, external of the skull and from the internal surface were prepared. In other words, they took pictures of the entrance wound of the skull with a scalp reflected. He testified to that for Warren Commission, okay? Those photographs don't exist. I've seen the original. I've seen all of them. They're not there. Dr. Petty, during testimony before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Dr. Fink was asked, if I understand you correctly, Dr. Fink, you wanted particularly to have a photograph made of the external aspects of the skull from the back to show that there was no cratering on the outside of the skull and there was cratering on the inside of the skull. He says, oh, absolutely. Did you ever see such a photograph? Dr. Fink says, no, I don't think so. And I brought with me memorandum showing, referring to the examination of photographs in 1967. And as I can recall, I never saw pictures of the outer aspect of the wound of entry in the back of the head and the inner aspect of the skull in order to show a crater. Although I was there asking for these photographs, I don't remember seeing those photographs. Now, again, as the only forensics guy there, he knew the importance of documenting the wounds. And so he would be there telling the autopsy photographer, John Stringer to take photographs of the skull wound so they could document the path of the bullet. And he says, I don't remember seeing those photographs. So, pardon me as I turn my phone off, I'm getting a call here. Assistant autopsy photographer Floyd Reeby was asked by the Assassination Review Board, do you recall whether any pictures were taken very close to inside the cranium? Oh, yes, I think Mr. Stringer did that when the body was on its side. In other words, they had the body on the side. They took some pictures of inside the cranium, and one of the autopsy photographers, who was John Stringer's assistant, remembers them having done that. Autopsy photographer John Stringer, did you take any photographs of the head after the scalp had been pulled down or reflected? Yes. Mr. Stringer said, those photographs don't exist. And there's numerous other examples of this. Stringer said that he took at least 2 exposures of the body cavity. They're not there either. Dr. Humes is reported in an HSCA memo to have specifically recalled photographs were taken of the president's chest. These photographs do not exist. Photographs had also toured the Warren Commission in 1964 that he'd taken photographs of the interior of Kennedy's chest. Dr. Boswell, the second in command, backed up Dr. Stringer and Humes. The HSCA, again, re-examining this in the late 1970s, recorded that they thought that they had photographed the thoracic cavity and the lung, but he doesn't remember ever seeing those photographs. Those photographs don't exist. So, in any case, that takes us to the issue of and I want to go back because the next examination from the original one, I mean, here you have all the doctors attesting that the autopsy photographs were present when they weren't, because the Justice Department had them say that, or had them sign off on that. That was still not satisfying people. And so in 1968, J. Thornton Boswell writes a letter to the Justice Department. And he says, as you are aware, the autopsy findings in the case of the late President John F. Kennedy, including x-rays and photographs, have been the subject of continuing controversy and speculation. Dr. Humes and I have felt for some time that an impartial board of experts, including pathologists and radiologists, should examine the available material. And this is a letter he wrote. But again, he did not write this letter. Again, these are the reasons why they began the Clark panel report, okay? And the members of the Clark panel who then went to re-examine the evidence included Dr. Carnes, Dr. Fisher, Dr. Morgan, and Dr. Moritz. They're all eminently qualified, a pathologist, a professor of pathology, another pathologist here, the Baltimore Medical Examiner, forensic pathologist, the chairman of the Department of Radiology at Johns Hopkins, and another pathologist at Case Western Reserve. But what did they think their job was? Okay, so apparently the panel was put together, and amazingly enough, Dr. Fisher, who was this fellow right here, the second listed here, he was the Baltimore Medical Examiner. Dr. Fisher admitted in 1977 in Maryland State Medical Journal that the Clark panel forensic pathologist, he admitted that Clark, the Attorney General, quote, became concerned about some statements that he'd seen in proofs of the not yet published book by Josiah Thompson, 6 Seconds in Dallas. Ramsey Clark decided to get a panel of people together to look at the autopsy evidence independently of all other investigations. And the result of this panel review was that we found some minor errors in JFK's autopsy protocol, such as the site of the entrance wound as being just above the external occipital protuberance. The Clark panel report was released, quote, partly to refute some of the junk that was in Tink Thompson's book, Fisher said. Now, Tink Thompson published a book called 6 Seconds in Dallas, which is famous in the Kennedy assassination, raising doubts about the official conclusion. He's most recently published another book called Last Second in Dallas, which I recommend to anyone who's interested in the case. But you have one of the Clark panelists admitting that they put them on the job to basically quash questions about the assassination, doubts about Oswald's guilt. So, this is from the Clark panel report. And what they decided is the original entrance wound was supposed to have been down here near the external occipital protuberance. And they said, no, it wasn't that. It was approximately 100 millimeters higher. And the bone at the lower edge of this hole that they point to right here is depressed. And you can see that the bone is depressed. This is part of the Clark panel report. So now this is a diagram of the back of a skull, and the original autopsy pathologist was shown the back of a skull and told, all right, you didn't exactly specify how many millimeters or centimeters from the external occipital protuberance, that's that knob at the back of the skull here, which I point to. You didn't tell us, point to exactly where, how close that was. So mark a skull about where the entrance wound was. And all three of them marked it here. In fact, I think it was Fink that even marked it lower than the external occipital protuberance. They all marked it right around here. Well, the Clark panel, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, other people said, no, it was much higher. And yet they kind of tried to smooth this over by calling this whopping error. Now imagine, this is toward the top of the back of your skull. This is at the bottom of the back of your skull. They called it missing the entrance wound by 10 centimeters and putting in a different bone, a minor error. Again, shaping the narrative. Again, supporting the government's position. Again, saying, oh, well, minor error, nothing to worry about here. And as I point out here, this is where the original pathologist marked a human skull to show right where they said it was. This is also, these references are again available online. Now, this is the original autopsy report, and it says there is, I can't even read it myself, but essentially there is a defect involving chiefly the right parietal bone on the right side, but extending somewhat into the temporal and occipital regions. Okay, and this is a diagram from the Rydberg diagram published by the Warren Commission, and 13 centimeters. Okay, and in this region there is an actual absence of scalp and bone, producing approximately 13 centimeters in greatest diameter. Okay, I put a question mark here because on the night of the autopsy, Boswell, and this is one of the documents did survive, have the a face sheet, and on the face sheet is the number 17, and 17 with an arrow going forward to aft, and it says missing. I don't know if you can read that. Missing forward to aft 17 centimeters. Well, he was asked about this, and Dr. Boswell said, well, when we got the body, we measured the defect. It was 17 centimeters of skull was missing. When a late arriving skull fragment fit back into the skull, then the defect only measured 13 centimeters, and that's what they put in the autopsy report. But essentially, they're saying that the defect was 17 centimeters from fore to aft. And here again, another version of that from another PowerPoint slide I made, the diagram which he made. And again, this shows where they marked the entrance wound. This is a diagram that represents what how Dr. Boswell described the skull defect when they first examined JFK. And he described this for the Assassination Records Review Board in the late 1990s. And he said the defect was huge, went from back down here to here. And of course, if you take a centimeter ruler and you measure from near the forehead backward, 13 centimeters would take you to about here. But if it was actually 17 centimeters, and we got to trust that these guys knew how to use a ruler, then the defect had to go way to the back of his head, way back in this area, right where they originally marked the skull. So now this is also from the original autopsy report that x-rays, the original doctors, the original autopsy report said that x-rays showed a fragment trail along a line corresponding with a line joining the above described small occipital bone of the entrance wound and the right supraorbital ridge. In other words, the original autopsy report says, well, there was a line of fragments, and here I'm going to demonstrate to anybody that that is watching this that you're much smarter than pathology, and then again shaping the narrative. Here's the external occipital protuberance. They said that the X-rays showed that there was a line of minute, small metallic fragments that went from this area of the skull to that area of the skull. Okay. Well, as you can all see here, here's that trail of fragments. It runs along the top of the skull, not down here. I've seen the originals. Now these are enhanced. This is an enhanced X-ray, and it does blot out some of the smaller fragments. but there's no small trail. The trail that you see is way up high here. And yet, in order to kind of continue and shape the narrative in a pro-government direction, they described a trail directionality, the autopsy report, to support the conclusion the bullet entered here. The Clark panel, then they said, well, no, the bullet hole was much higher. And they described, and this is from the Clark panel report, that on the lateral film, this fragment formation trails a long axis, if extended posteriorly, passes through the above mentioned entrance hole, i.e., the Clark panel said, well, this is the entrance hole, it's right here, and the fragment trail goes to here toward the front. Well, as anyone watching this can see, that fragment trail doesn't go anywhere near there. It's much higher than that. Now, that's not just my view. That fragment trail does not line up with either the autopsy report's claim. It's much higher. And in 1978, the House Select Committee's expert radiologist, Dave Davis, reported that the trail extended anteriorly from the inner table of the skull at a point approximately 6 centimeters anterior superiorly from the previously described embedded metal fragment. Now, what that means is that there is an embedded metal fragment right here near this entrance hole. And he says exactly what I have found myself, that this trail is 6 centimeters above that. That's where the trail is. But again, Clark panel was there to support the government's conclusion and to shape the narrative. Again, they're saying that the fragment trail runs from here to here. That's not where the fragment trail runs at all. Again, we beat this to death. Okay, again, this is what their Clark panel was trying to argue, that that on lateral film number 2, on the long axis, if extended posteriorly, it passes through the above mentioned new entrance hole, but it doesn't at all. All right, so the Clark panel report on page 9 writes that a well-designed zone of discoloration is present on its upper and outer margins. Now, which has a the appearance of an entrance wound. Now, just to go through this, if a bullet enters perfectly perpendicular to perfectly round open, burn mark around the edge of it. If it goes from above downward, you'll find the bruising is greater above, because it first strikes the tissue going downward at the higher end of the wound and then drives lower. And so there's a zone of discoloration, as it were, above. And if it goes from below upward, the zone of discoloration is greater below. And the Clark panel reports here that it is most pronounced in its upper and outer margins. Well, anyone looking at this photograph, and unfortunately, this doesn't show it as well as the originals do, but the zone of discoloration, and they wanted to, again, to support the idea, Kennedy was shot from above and behind. Therefore, the zone of discoloration is greatest at the upper edge of the wound because the bullet was going down when it hit him. And so the zone of discoloration is greater in its upper part of the wound, but it isn't, as anyone looking at this can see. It's greater at the lower part of the wound. The actual zone of discoloration shows that the bullet, if anything, seemed to have been going slightly upward. In any case, let's go on to the next investigation. But again, always shaping the narrative. They will look at the evidence and interpret it in a way that supports the government's vision. So here we have the Rockefeller Commission. That's the next official investigation of JFK's medical autopsy evidence. But they were looking at a lot of other information. And Seymour Hersh revealed that the CIA had conducted widespread and illegal domestic surveillance and mail openings of law-abiding citizens during the Vietnam era. And it led to a big eruption in 1974. This front page story, there's a picture of it right there. And so they established the Rockefeller Commission, and Vice President of the United States established it, and Nelson Rockefeller. And they appointed Nelson Rockefeller to head it. Of course, Nelson Rockefeller himself had been involved in a lot of the CIA's skullduggery. Former Warren Commission counsel David Bellin was named as the executive director, certainly somebody that could be very objective about the Warren Commission's conclusions. And the New York Times' Tom Wicker pointed out that the commission looks suspiciously like a goat set to guard a cabbage patch. Having the CIA investigated by such a group like this is having the mafia audited by its own accountants. Well, that's exactly right. But among the charges that they wanted to investigate was something pertaining to JFK's medical and autopsy evidence. So David Bellin said that since I had served as assistant counsel with the Warren Commission, I removed myself from direct responsibility for any investigation pertaining to the assassination, because they were investigating aspects of the Kennedy assassination. But in 1988, he admitted that when Rockefeller's medical experts convened to review JFK's autopsy evidence, Bellin personally attended that meeting and examined the autopsy photographs and x-rays right alongside his consultants. Dr. Wecht, a famous Warren Commission critic, ripped Bellin's Warren Commission roots, and the medical panel itself is made up of people who have been associated with the Baltimore Medical Examiner's Office, the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, the Department of Radiology. All these people had prior ties to prior government investigations. And as Wecht said, the commission is has set up a panel of governmental sycophants to defend the Warren report, and all the members of the panel appointed by the Rockefeller Commission have strong ties to the federal government and close professional relationships with individuals who have formally participated in studies defending the Warren report. And I'm not going to go through all this, but you can find these all online. All these people, Dr. Olivier, who was the guy who said that the duplication experiments showed that the skulls that they shot to duplicate Kennedy's wounds looked just like Kennedy. Well, of course they didn't, but he gets brought back in. Dr. Latimer, who's always defended the Warren Commission and who happens to be J. Edgar Hoover's urologist. And of course, Warner Spitz, who had previously been had worked with Dr. Russell Fisher, and all these other people had ties to prior government investigations. And it said that a re-examination was made of the question of whether the movement of the president's head and body following a fatal shot are consistent with the president being struck from the right rear or the right front, or both the right front and rear. That was one of the things that they wanted to investigate. And on April 15th, 1975, one of the Rockefeller Commission's counsels, Robert Olson, wrote a memo to the file on his own telephone conversation with Cyril Wecht. Cyril Wecht, by then, was quite publicly skeptical of the Warren report and the government's conclusion. And he noted that Dr. Wecht had asked whether the Rockefeller Commission was going to be getting access to the following items which have not been made, which have not been to date made available for examinations to the autopsy. In other words, were these guys, if they're going to reinvestigate the Kennedy assassination, they can look at JFK's brain, Kodachrome slides of the interior of the president's chest, microscopic slides of tissue taken from the various parts of the president's body, especially those related to the wound areas. And he asked these questions because Wecht knew that material had been available. JFK's brain had undergone a special autopsy examination. The autopsy pathologist said that they took Kodachrome slides of the interior of the president's chest, and they also took slides of tissue taken from various parts of the president's body. And Wecht asked, are your experts here going to be looking at that stuff and reporting on it? So 3 days later, David Bellin, Robert Olson sat down with their medical experts for what they called a panel of consultants meeting. And they asked them, all the panelists, to respond to a list of 14 questions, and among them, whether examining the missing evidence that Wecht had specified, Kennedy's brain, tissue slides, and chest photographs, was necessary to arrive at a reliable judgment concerning the number of shots. In other words, Wecht didn't then know that this stuff was missing. He later found out, was the first one to report that JFK's brain is missing and the slides were missing. But they knew that this information was missing. And so they asked their hand-picked consultant stooges, essentially, do you need to have this material to arrive at a reliable judgment concerning the number of shots which hits the president or the angles from which they were fixed? And they all wrote back, oh, no, well, this is Dr. Spitz's. I do not believe that an examination of the president's brain would contribute significantly to a clarification of the circumstance of the murder, and that microscopic examination of the skin of the slides of bullets taken would not, in my opinion, have added pertinent data. It's complete rubbish. And microscopic slides, according to one of the, well-known forensic pathologists, that microscopic slides through a gunshot wound of entrance show an abrasion ring. You remember that little ring we showed earlier? It's called an abrasion ring. Actual wounds don't show that. So if you have tissue slides from these wounds, you'll know whether there's an abrasion ring or not. Of course, that would be important. Besides an abrasion ring, Dr. DeMaio said that microscopic presence of gray-colored tissue wipe or soot from the bullet would also be important. Well, but these guys, Werner Spitz wasn't there to necessarily, he was there to support the government. So he said, no, we don't need to have that material. Not one of Rockefeller's experts so much as hinted that the tissue slides would have helped confirm a key corollary of the single bullet theory, that tissues taken from the edges of the bullet holes in Kennedy's back and rear scalp showed the distinctive microscopic signs of a bullet's entrance, which they would have shown had they survived. But they, again, like other evidence in this case, vanished. Not one of them said having JFK's brain to examine, which of course would have been crucially important, and not just photos of it would be important. In other words, they basically told David Bellin, Warren Commission counsel, and the Rockefeller Commission what they wanted to hear. They also said a number of other things. They said that the trail of fragments, as they had the Clark panel lined up between that high entrance wound, the external occipital protuberance, just as the Clark panel had. Again, complete rubbish. It was wrong, false, but they concluded that. I'm not going to go through all the errors they made. But it is worth reading this. Richard Lindenberg, one of the Rockefeller Commission, said that in the hole in the skin, which we showed you before, also shows the markings of an entrance wound, a discrete zone of dark discoloration of the marginal skin, most prominent in the upper and lateral margin of the wound. This zone is practically absent at the lower edge. In other words, the abrasion collar is the upper part of the wound, showing that the bullet was going downward. Unfortunately, Werner Spitz, one of the other consultants, didn't get the memo, and he wrote, "There is no doubt that the bullet which struck the presence struck the presence back, penetrated the back in a sharply upward direction, as is evident from the width of the abrasion at the lower half of the bullet wound of entrance." He must have missed the memo that you're not supposed to say that, it is evident that in this injury that the missile traveled upwards within the body. And of course, here we are, again, to show you the abrasion ring would be perfectly round if it hit perpendicularly. If it came from up down, the abrasion collar would be greatest and discoloration would be greatest above. If it came from below upward, the abrasion collar and the discoloration would be greater below. And where is it greatest? Here. This doesn't give it. This, again, it's an artist rendition from the House Select Committee on Assassination. It does demonstrate that the greatest portion of the abrasion collar is down below, but the original autopsy photographs show it best. That's the actual zone. But they're willing to say what the government wants them to say. There it is, and you can see it's greater below than it is anywhere else. There appears to be something here. This is not as evident in the original autopsy photographs, but this is clearly evident. All right, again, this is Dr. Lindenberg saying that the stumps on the fibers in the front of JFK's shirt showed the torn fibers of the material pointing outside. Well, that's complete rubbish. In 1964, J. Edgar Hoover told the Warren Commission that the FBI lab had found the same thing. J. Edgar Hoover reported that the hole in the front of the shirt, JFK's shirt, was a ragged slit-like hole. At the ends of the torn threads around the hole were bent outwards. These characteristics are typical of an entrance projectile, of an entrance hole for a projectile. Well, Dr. Lindenberg was apparently not aware of what Warren Commission skeptic had pointed out years before, and that had long been discovered, and what the HSCA reported. Quote, this is the HSCA reporting this. The FBI laboratory's initial description, which preceded Hoover's letter to the Warren Commission, by the way, did not offer evidence concerning the direction of fibers. No bent fibers were noted when the FBI lab initially examined JFK's shirt. The first report that they were bent outward appeared in Hoover's letter to the Warren Commission. He was fabricating material to keep also. In any case, Robert McKeegan says, one of the Rockefeller Commissions, that the president's head motion is inconsistent with the shot striking him from any direction other than from the rear, which is complete rubbish. Werner Spitz says it's impossible to conclude the direction of the head and body following the headshot from which direction the shots came, and Dr. Hodges said that the motion of the president's head, as shown in the Zapruder film, does not indicate the direction of the shot, in my opinion. But see, Dr. McKeegan was not just a forensic pathologist as these others were. He was I think in the Navy. He was a government, a military pathologist. And again, always saying stuff which is complete rubbish. So Aberdeen Proving Grounds did some shooting tests to see what would happen. And here we have Larry Sturdivant testifying to the shooting tests that they did, because a lot of shooting tests have been done to try to prove whether the head would of test skulls, what would happen if you shot test skulls. And in addition to the wounds which we already saw in that photograph, Larry Sturdivant testified that as he was showing a very high, it's just something like a 2200 frame per second film of a skull being shot in the Aberdeen Proving Grounds. And he says, as you can see, because he showed the film twice of two different skulls, as you can see, of the two skulls that we have observed so far have moved in the direction of the bullet. In other words, both of them have been given some momentum in the direction that the bullet was going. This third one also shows momentum in the direction the bullet was going, showing that the head of the president would probably go with the bullet. Now, this is the government own test done on human skulls filled with brain equivalent material. And he concludes, in fact, all 10 of the skulls that we shot did essentially the same thing. They all went away from the rifle, not toward it, as Kennedy is supposed to have done. Dr. Latimer testified that he'd done some experiments to test both the damage effects of a bullet fired into the president of the rear of the head and the principle of the jet effect, which is supposed to explain that the bullet went in small, exploded toward the front. That exit of a lot of debris toward the front drove Kennedy's head backward. And Dr. Latimer said that he presented to the Warren Commission as evidence, and to the Rockefeller Commission as evidence, both a motion picture film and still photographs showing the results of his experiments. Okay, and here you see this is from Latimer's experiments, and you can see that the skull is sitting on top of a ladder, flat with the jaw flat against the top of the ladder. Bullet comes in from above and behind, as for Latimer, and you can see that the skull is somewhere in this debris here. What is worth noticing here is notice how the ladder is tipped forward. You can see that there is a slight tipping here, but it's greatly exaggerated because the bullet hits the skull. The jaw is laying flat on the top of the ladder, and the momentum is imparted to the ladder, moving the ladder forward, and the test skull bounces backward after the forward momentum applied to the skull, which we saw happening in all these human experiments done by the government itself. That forward momentum drove it. The ladder tips forward as in response to Latimer's bullet. So again, completely bogus test that gave people the information that the government wanted, that Kennedy's shot came from behind and it drove the skull backward. The government's own shooting tests are never mentioned. The ones that were done in 1964, never mentioned. The ones, and in other later reviews recently by Lucian Haig and other people, they all refer to the jet effect. There is no jet effect. The jet effect does not explain it. The only thing that can really explain Kennedy's motion is a direct force by the bullet shot from the right front. And again, according to Dr. Latimer, the wounds shown in his test skulls, and here's an example of his test skulls, are very similar to those of the president. Well, there's Dr. Latimer's test skull that shows, part of the frontal bone missing. The frontal bone goes a little bit beyond that, and just mostly the frontal and the anterior portion of the parietal bone missing. Well, that's not what happened to Jack Kennedy. Here's what Jack Kennedy. Here is the diagram that Dr. Boswell prepared for the Assassination Documents Review Board, and here's from the original autopsy report, or the notes from the autopsy, 17 centimeters missing, that the skull defect went way back here. So Dr. Olivier who was then testifying for the Rockefeller Commission, credited Luis Alvarez with originated studies into the jet effect that gave you this rearward motion. Bullet went in the back of his head, exploded out to the front. The jet from the front drove the head backward. And we don't have time to go into this in great detail, but some of you can find this on the web. It's in Tink Thompson's new book. Louis Alvarez did some shooting experiments and shot melons and showed rearward recoil, but he didn't just shoot ordinary melons with the Mannlicher Arcano. He used a soft-pointed hunting round, and not at 2,000 feet per second like a Mannlicher Arcano, but juiced it up to 3,200 feet per second, and then shot at melons that weigh about a half or 2/3 and have a soft cover, and then got jet effect. And he said, well, if we had shot at a number of different things and only reported the ones that gave us reverse recoil back toward the rifle, we could be criticized. But as we did the experiments, this is what we got. Therefore, I think Kennedy was shot from above and behind. Well, it turns out, as Tink Thompson puts out in his new book, and as I've lectured about, and so has he, Louis Alvarez shot at a lot of different things in his so-called duplication test. Everything he shot at went away from the rifle, except for the melons, and that's what he reported in the literature. That's what Dr. Olivier cites here, and that's what most people who defend the Warren Commission's report, including other people recently, are arguing for a jet effect, which is, again, complete rubbish. Let's, without going through too much detail, David Bellin was not the only one that had stark conflicts of interests. You can find this on at the essay originally, but all these other people who were appointed by Rockefeller had huge conflicts of interest and close connections to the Rockefellers themselves. Of course, Ronald Reagan was also appointed, and of course, he had no experience with the CIA, and he attended few of the Rockefeller Commission's meeting. So then finally we get to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and it explored the medical autopsy evidence. And let's go back to what the professor of neurosurgery wrote on November 22nd. He just examined Jack Kennedy, treated him to try to, he was the senior examining physician for the president. And he wrote that there was a large wound beginning in the right occiput, extending into the right parietal region. This is what he wrote. Now, this is a professor of neurosurgery, knows head wounds. He says that there was a large wound beginning at the right occiput. The occiput is right in the occipital bone, the back of the head, extending into the parietal region. Much of the skull appeared to be gone at the brief examination. And Dr. Clark's claim of a rearward skull defect was also repeated by Parkland doctors, including Professor Marion Thomas Jenkins, who was an anesthesiologist who sat at the head. He sat within inches of the president's head. He also described the wound that way in contemporaneous notes. Also was described that way by Dr. Malcolm Perry, Dr. Robert McClellan, Dr. Charles Carrico, Dr. Ronald Coy Jones, Dr. Gene Aiken, Paul Peters, Charles Rufus Baxter. All these doctors were in there, and they all described the same thing. Several of them, I can't remember which off the top of my head right now, wrote these descriptions down. So I want that to set with you for just a moment, and I want to take a little mini break here for a moment. This is what was written on the night of the assassination, or the afternoon of the assassination, after doctors who see lots of trauma examine President Kennedy's wound. They describe this wound in the right occiput. Okay, I'm going to take just a moment's break here, and I'll come right back. All right, didn't take too long, I hope. In any case, so here we are. This is written in notes that are published by the Warren Commission. In fact, I think this note's in the Warren report itself, but it was written by the professor of neurosurgery, the senior examining physician, but a number of these other people were also faculty members. And Parkland Hospital in Dallas is a major trauma center. I was a general surgeon. I was an admitting general surgery resident at another major trauma center at UCLA. UCLA is Harvard General Hospital. And we see lots of trauma. These guys are extremely experienced with trauma. I'm sure it's not much different than Harvard General Hospital. Parkland is one of the places that is like on the list of major trauma centers, and people that are there have lots of experience with this and know what they're talking about. In any case, and Clark's account fits pretty much with what was in the Warren report as a description of a parietal temporal occipital skull defect. And it's also pretty consistent with what we see in Boswell's sketch, 17 centimeters missing, but it doesn't match the autopsy photographs, as you'll see right here. This, again, is an original autopsy photograph. Again, as I said before, not as high quality as what we see, or what I saw in the originals, but this basically shows a defect which is in front of the right ear, involving the top of the head, but with no visible defect behind the ear. It's nowhere near the occipital area that was specified in the autopsy report or by the Parkland doctors. Both the Parkland doctors and the autopsy doctors described a wound that extended into the occipital portion of the skull. Well, the House Select Committee on Assassinations realized that there was a conflict, there was a problem. The Parkland doctors described a defect in the back of the head, and it does not appear to be in the autopsy photographs. What are we going to do? So it reported that it interviewed the people who were present at the autopsy. And the House Select Committee on Assassinations reported that in disagreement with the observations of the Parkland doctors are the 26 people present at JFK's autopsy. All those interviewed who attended the autopsy corroborated the general location of the wounds as depicted in the autopsy photographs. None had differing accounts. It appeared more probable that the observations of the Parkland doctors are incorrect. So the Parkland doctors just made a mistake. That was their view, okay? And we know that because all the people that we interviewed who actually were at the autopsy endorsed the wounds as you see in the autopsy. They all basically agreed with this, all right? Well, it wasn't until the Assassinations Record Review Board released these documents that we found out that the HSCA had completely misrepresented both what the autopsy witnesses told the Warren Commission originally and what they had told the HSCA. All those interviews had been suppressed. They had no national security importance. There was no reason to have withheld those autopsy witnesses' accounts or statements. It had nothing to do with protecting national security, but what they did have to do with is protecting the view Kennedy had been shot from above and behind. The doctors who saw a bigger wound that might have suggested somebody else besides Oswald had done it, those guys were all wrong. But rather than contradicting the Parkland witnesses that there was a rear defect in JFK's skull, these suppressed interviews revealed that the Bethesda witnesses actually corroborated them. They not only described a rear defect to the HSCA, which the HSCA suppressed, they also drew diagrams. Well, let's go through some of these. Here's a drawing made by the autopsy technician, James Curtis Jenkins. Again, saw a lot of them. He's showing a defect. He's showing, there's the back of the head and showing a defect here on the right rear of the head. Here's the front with the clavicles, entrance wound there. Here there was a scar. Kennedy had a scar back down here, defect in the back of the head. Here was one made by an FBI agent present at the autopsy, showing a defect squarely in the back of the head. Here's one made by another FBI agent showing a defect in the back of the head, right rear. This is pretty good correlation to what they said. Here's one by Sandra K. Spencer. Now, she says that she saw an original autopsy photograph that showed a defect in the rear of the head. Not present in those autopsy photographs that are available now. She helped develop autopsy photographs. Here's one by Tom Robinson, who was the mortician who prepared the body for burial. Defect back here in the rear of the head. All these were suppressed. Dr. Boswell's lab assistant, Jan Rudnicki, said that the back right quadrant of the head was missing. The radiologist who was there taking the x-rays said the back of the head was missing. Commanding officer of the Military District of Washington, Philip Whale, wrote in a memo, he said that he noted that JFK's wound was in the back of the head, so you would not see it because the president was lying face up. So it was so far back. Well, I can't even, let's see. I cannot read what I say up here. Let's see if I can, oh yes, okay. Oh, here's the question about JFK's autopsy photographs. It says that they were authenticated by experts. So in other words, one of the ways that the House Select Committee defended its conclusions was saying that, well, we've looked at the x-rays and the photographs, and the autopsy photographs were authenticated by experts. And I won't read this to you. This is part of the House Select Committee on Assassination, and it said, because the Department of Defense because the Department of Defense was unable to locate the camera and lens that were used to take these autopsy photographs, the photographic panel that reviewed this stuff was unable to engage in an analysis similar to the one undertaken with Oswald backyard pictures that was designed to determine whether a particular camera in issue had been used to take the photographs that were the subject of the inquiry. So they said, well, we couldn't find the camera, but the photographs are clearly that of Jack Kennedy, and we were not able to find the camera to completely conclude, close the loop, but we're very comfortable that with the authenticity of the images. Okay. But the House Select Committee on Assassination was sent a camera. It didn't like the camera that the Defense Department had sent. So it sent a letter asking the Secretary of Defense to look for another camera. The House Select Committee's chief counsel, Robert Blakely, explained the problem. Well, you sent us a camera, quote, our photographic experts have determined that this camera, or at least the particular lens and shutter attachment, could not have been used to take JFK's autopsy pictures. In other words, they looked at the camera, they compared it with the autopsy photographs they had. They said, well, this camera didn't take those pictures. The Department of Defense wrote back to the HSCA that Bethesda only had one camera of its type in possession, and that the only camera in use at the National Naval Medical Center in 1963 had already been sent to the HSCA for its studies. And I'll try to bring this down so I can read it. So to authenticate Kennedy's autopsy photographs, they asked them to get the camera. They wanted to see the camera so they could evaluate it. And they did. The Navy sent them a camera. The HSCA tested the camera and found that our photographic experts had determined that this camera didn't take JFK's autopsy photographs. So the HSCA asked the Navy to look for another one. So the Navy sent them a fact sheet that said, a fact sheet saying that they, quote, strongly reiterates the Navy's position that the camera provided of the HSCA was indeed the camera used at the autopsy photograph, but it does not manage that. Okay, so what? So the Navy sent the HSCA a fact sheet that strongly reiterates the Navy's position that the camera provided the HSCA, that the camera provided to the HSCA was indeed the camera used to take JFK's autopsy photographs. So how does the HSCA report this conflict to the public? It says because the Department of Defense was unable to locate the camera and lens that were used to take the autopsy photographs. In other words, it completely, buries the fact that they had gotten what the Navy said was certainly the camera taking the autopsy photographs. And they said, well, because they were unable to locate the camera. Well, they did have the camera. Unfortunately, it doesn't match the autopsy photographs. So the irony here is that the House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded that on the basis of the evidence available to it, that President John F. Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. That's what the House Select Committee on Assassination concluded. on the basis of a lot of evidence, including most importantly, the acoustics evidence, which of course we're not going to discuss today. I would refer people who are interested in that aspect of the case to look at Tink Thompson's new book, Last Second in Dallas. He goes into that in considerable detail and has done some new research, which again confirms the notion that acoustics evidence shows that there was probably a conspiracy. But the House Select Committee on Assassinations did conclude there was a conspiracy, but it misreported the evidence about the autopsy camera and the autopsy witnesses in a way that undermined the House Select Committee's own conspiracy conclusions. It withheld non-sensitive documents about the problems with the autopsy camera, which only came out in the 1990s, and the statements of the autopsy witnesses from both the forensic panel and the public. Why didn't the forensics panel interview JFK's personal physician, George Berkley, who asked to be interviewed and he hinted at a conspiracy? Why didn't the HSCA or the forensic panel that worked for the House Select Committee on Assassination look into reports that autopsy photographs were missing? So I'm not going to go through this. That's a subject for another talk. Dr. George Berkley was the president's personal physician. He rode with a presidential caravan through Dallas, and he went to Parkland Hospital and was with the doctors that were trying to resuscitate Jack Kennedy. He then flew with the president's body, stayed with the casket, and went with President's body to Bethesda and was present during the autopsy. During an oral history, Dr. Berkley was asked, "Do you agree with the Warren report on the number of bullets that entered the president's body?" Berkley answered, "I would not care to be quoted on that." This response from the physician closest to all the autopsy-related events elicited no official interest. But 10 years later, Berkley was still troubled. In early 1977, Berkley's attorney, William Illig, contacted the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Richard Sprague. And George Berkley, as I said, he was intimately familiar with JFK's medical history. He participated at Parkland. He traveled with a body to the by all official investigations. Wasn't interviewed by the Warren Commission, wasn't interviewed by the Clark panelists, wasn't interviewed by the Rockefeller Commission, wasn't interviewed by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, but Berkley continued to harbor private doubts. Here is a memo that basically says that Berkley had Berkley. Now, the memo was written by William Illig, who was the private attorney for Dr. Berkley, and he wrote on Berkley's behalf to inform that although he had been JFK's personal physician, he'd never been interviewed about the assassination, and he advised that he had, quote, information that others besides Oswald must have participated. Okay, so they never interviewed him. They never asked him about that information. However, the House Select Committee on Assassination Counsel's Andy Purdy and Mark Flanagan did reach Dr. Berkley, but their only purpose was not to ask about that, was to extract an affidavit saying that no one could have intercepted JFK's body before it had gotten to the morgue, and that JFK's wounds had not been altered between Dallas and the postmortem. Berkley wrote up an affidavit declaring that, quote, Berkley, had remained within the ambulance with the president's body in the casket and also on the plane. The casket was neither open nor disturbed in any way, and also that there was no interference in the nature of the wounds as seen in Dallas as compared with those seen in the morgue, which of course we've seen as true. Questions about how Berkley knew that others besides Oswald must have participated, even though they'd gotten the memo at the HSCA that drew none of Purdy or Flanagan's attention, nor did the HSCA staff pass Berkley's lead to their own forensics doctors. In other words, the doctor who had attended the president that lead was not passed to the forensic consultants, the forensic pathologists on the House Select Committee's forensics panel. Berkley remained a skeptic. Author Henry Hurt, in his book wrote in 1982, wrote that in 1982, Dr. Berkley told the author in a telephone conversation that he believed the President Kennedy assassination was a result of a conspiracy. So Hurt was very interested in this, and he later contacted Berkley to arrange for a face-to-face interview. So 2 months after they had exchanged promising letters, the doctor responded with an abrupt refusal to discuss any aspect of the case. Somebody had gotten to Dr. Berkley and shut him up. Henry Hurt, who was going to be getting the story from Dr. Berkley, never did get that story. And so the one thing that I think we need to understand is something that was written in response to Oliver Stone's JFK, and I think that it's something that bears repeating here. And he said, it is one of contemporary journalism's most disastrous conceits that the truth cannot exist in the absence of revealed evidence, i.e. revealed by the government. By accepting the tyranny of the known as told by the government, the media inevitably relies on the official version of the truth, seldom asking the government to prove its case, while demanding of critics that the official version of the most critics of that official version, they demand the most exacting tests of evidence. In other words, this has been the case with the Kennedy case, that we have repeatedly caught the government misstating evidence, withholding evidence, denying evidence, suppressing evidence, and falsifying evidence. And the press, the media never asked the government to prove its case. But whenever there is a skeptic who challenges the government's case, they're run through a horrible gauntlet. And nowhere is this more visible than in the Kennedy's medical autopsy evidence. The original official findings are accepted without any serious scrutiny, as if the government was not institutionally incapable of anything but impartiality in telling us the truth. Challenges are always run through the most withering gauntlet, perhaps for the obvious reason that it is the government that sits in judgment of the merits of the challenge. And I think that this is one of the things that we face in the Kennedy case, and that is that the only people who they will accept as being credible on this subject is the government conclusions themselves. But let's understand how these investigations should be looked at. And occasionally, some truth will slip out. The Church Committee reinvestigated a number of crimes committed by the government, and it reported regarding the Kennedy assassination that Director Hoover, the Justice Department, and the White House exerted pressure on officials to affirm Oswald's guilt. In other words, the Church Committee admitted this, that Director Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, who had the dirt on everyone, he had dirt on Earl Warren, on all members. And the one thing I don't have a slide here to show, but something which, if anyone wants to contact me, I'll send them to the link. And it's in some essays I've written. J. Edgar Hoover had checked the Warren Commission and all the members of the Warren Commission, including their assistant counsels and everything else, for derogatory information. In other words, his conclusion that Oswald had done it was going to be the conclusion the government was going to reach. And he checked everyone for derogatory information in case he would need it. In any case, they all joined in lockstep. The Justice Department, which, of course, was Director J. Edgar Hoover, and the White House exerted pressure on officials to affirm that Oswald was guilty. So what physician chosen by the Justice Department to act as a government Clark panel reviewer in 1968, or the Rockefeller or the House Select Committee physicians would have dared challenge a Justice Department conclusion that had earned Earl Warren's prestigious endorsement? So the carry away from this is how the narrative is established by the government early on, and officials continue pushing that narrative throughout the investigation. Good military pathologists are given false information that 3 shots were heard before the president fell forward to the floor of the limousine, and that a rifle barrel was seen being withdrawn from an upper floor of a window behind JFK. During the 36 hours between the end of JFK's autopsy and the final written draft of the autopsy report, when the government and news media were solidifying around the theory Oswald had done it, it's difficult to imagine the government pathologists would be willing to defy the overwhelming conventional wisdom. The Warren Commission didn't examine autopsy x-rays. They may have seen one or two of the photographs, but they didn't really examine them. It certainly had no expert examine them, nor did they subject them to an independent scrutiny by outside experts. Statement by one of Clark's experts probably reflects how the Justice Department had conveyed to the panelists in the Clark panel their marching orders. Namely, as Russell Fisher described it, one of their jobs was to refute some of the junk that was in Tim Thompson's book. They went in there having been charged. Now imagine you're a well-known forensic pathologist in a political position as a coroner in Baltimore, and Russell Fisher was well-credentialed, we're not saying that, but it's a political position. Now, the Attorney General of the United States calls you up and says there's some unpatriotic junk in this book, 6 Seconds in Dallas, and we want you to go in and help us, deal with this junk that's appearing in this book. So the final report was issued as discussed, as showing their examination showed a remarkable degree of professional sloppiness, especially for men of such high distinction. And they arrived at the conclusions. Now, who would have dared challenge Earl Warren, J. Edgar Hoover, and the government in that era? In any case, there is much more we could discuss. I am going to go now to a Q&A with anyone that would care to see it or would care to ask questions. And I'm going to put myself on a video now. And I'll ask the host to start the video if you'd like. And I will start my video. Okay.
Yeah, Gary, you're going to have to unshare your screen.
Okay. Stop sharing. Okay, there we go. There we go. All right.
Okay. All right. We're back live or liver with you and me, Gary. And thank you for that absolutely excellent presentation and the great slides. Those are absolutely fantastic. So let's get into the Q&A. A lot of the questions were before you came, we were discussing rock and roll, so we won't go into those. But somebody did ask me to comment before you arrived on the memo that circulated in the White House right after the assassination that indicated that Oswald needed to be pegged as the real assassin without any help. I think he's referring to the Katzenbach memo.
Yes, he is. Yeah. Well, you may, Jacob, I think that you can probably speak to that as eloquently and as expertly as I can. There's a lot written about the Katzenbach memo. And by the way, for people who are interested in this, if you Google my name, Max Holland, JFK, Max Holland, Gary Aguilar, JFK, and it's an essay I wrote, and I go into the Katzenbach memo in considerable detail. Now, I wrote it years ago, and I can't remember exactly a lot of the details, but Katzenbach memo reflects memos that were circulating in the Justice Department outside Katzenbach and directly from J. Edgar Hoover. They wanted to issue, J. Edgar Hoover did not want an independent investigation and leaned heavily against the idea of there being an independent investigation. But ultimately, so much pressure was being brought to bear that they agreed they would have one. And of course, Hoover knew how to control investigations like that. He file checked everyone for derogatory information. And if you go Google up that Aguilar, Max Holland, and Max Holland rescues the Warren Commission and the nation, it's a long essay that it has all the hot links to the original documents and the fact that that's exactly what they were going to try to do. They're going to try to suppress any kind of independent conclusion other than the one that Hoover wanted people to reach. Now, why would Hoover want to conclude that Oswald alone had done it? Well, if there had been a conspiracy, then that would have meant that Hoover missed it. And had anyone really looked very closely at Oswald, which they did not do, it's worth noticing, and I also mentioned this in that essay, that the Warren Commission did not have an independent FBI expert on its panel investigating what the FBI had done. They instead turned to somebody in the FBI who had concluded that Carlos Marcello, the well-known mafia don, was a tomato salesman. They missed, the Warren Commission missed all the links that Jack Ruby had to the mafia. And there's probably 150 pages in the House Select Committee's on assassination, I think 11th volume or 10th volume or something like that, that goes into all the links between Ruby and the mafia. Well, the Warren Commission missed all that because the FBI was not going to investigate that. So I should look more at the camera. So you're absolutely right. The Katzenbach memo captures the fact that very early on, the Justice Department, the FBI, and the President of the United States, and the media. Let's bring the media into this. If you look at the New York Times edition of the Warren Report, which incidentally was released simultaneously with the government's edition, and I have copies of both in paperback and hardbound, but the New York Times edition, there is an introductory essay written by Anthony Lewis of the New York Times. And Anthony Lewis writes in his introduction, which you can find, and I've made reference to this in other essays, that the Warren Commission released all the evidence that it accumulated concerning the events in Dallas, including evidence that they may not have agreed with, and it withheld only the names of a few personnel in American embassies for national security reasons. Otherwise, it released all the evidence that it had accumulated, whether agreeing with its conclusions Oswald did it or not. Well, that was just a complete fabrication. I wrote Anthony Lewis and asked him whether he'd come up with that himself or somebody at the Warren Commission had told him that. Certainly, someone in the Warren Commission told him that. Well, the Warren Commission documents kept being filtered out and flitted out slowly over the following many decades. And finally, when the Assassination Records Review Board came along in the 1990s, they looked into it and found that there were still 3,000 pages of Warren Commission documents that are being withheld. So you automatically had the paragons of the leftist, anti-government, leftist media signing up lockstep with the government on the Warren Report and on the conclusions Oswald did it. And they have continuously done that. And you can never trust anything the New York Times says about the Warren Commission's conclusions, as you can't trust them about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction or lots of other things. But this goes right along with the Katzenbach. They got all the major players, and no doubt the major media players, on board. Oswald did it. He did it alone. And it went right from the government to our government-influenced media as well. Thank you, guys. Any other questions?
Yep. Okay, next question. When John Connolly passed away, Nellie would not allow the remaining bullet to be removed. Connolly never changed his story. How can anyone believe the magic bullet?
Let me recommend that that people that are interested in this, there's a wealth of material. And I think ultimately it wouldn't have made any difference whether they let them retrieve that little bullet fragment that was still lodged in his thigh or not. I don't think that would have made any difference ultimately. But there is an essay that I wrote with Tink Thompson, and we did some original research, okay? And it's right up there in all the declassified documents and letters from the Assassination Records Review Board, and all these suppressed documents are up there. Thank you, Assassination Records Review Board, for this. It turns out that the bullet that they found on a stretcher was picked up by one of the Parkland Hospital personnel, was passed to a Secret Service agent named Richard Johnson, Johnsen. He then carried back to Washington, gave it to the chief of the Secret Service, who then gave it to the FBI. Okay, so it passed through 4 hands. Okay, in 1964, a few months later, the Warren Commission was trying to chase down the chain of possession, so it sent the bullet around to show it to the witnesses, and the witnesses, particularly the 2 that first had. Said, it didn't look like that to me. And then they showed to the Secret Service agent, and he said, didn't look like that to me either. And they gave it to the chief of the Secret Service, who had it. He said, didn't look like that to me either. The bullet that we now have as Commission 399 is not the bullet that was found on a stretcher. The bullet that was found on a stretcher according to a guy named O.P. Wright, who had been a lawman for 20 years before, working as personnel director at Parkland Hospital. He'd been a lawman. He was a guns and ammo kind of guy. He knew all about weapons. And he said right in 1967, when Tim Thompson first interviewed him, he said, no, the bullet had a pointed tip. And he pulled a bullet out from his drawer, put it on his desk, and said it looked like this. Well, you'll find that there's an essay I wrote called "The Magic Bullet: More Magical Than We Knew" that will go through all this. So no, we can't. Now, why would not have gotten that little fragment out have been of any great value? And I think the reason for it is this. One of the things that really swayed the House Select Committee on Assassinations that Oswald had done it was some work testified to by a guy named Vincent Gwynn called Neutron Activation Analysis, NAA, Neutron Activation Analysis. And Vincent Gwynn analyzed the bullets and 399 and concluded that all the fragments recovered from assassination, the fragments as well as 399, all traced to 2 bullets that had been firearms matched to Oswald's rifle and to no other bullets. And that was very convincing to people. And he gave that presentation early on in a House Select Committee on Assassinations meetings. And so the wind went out of the sails, even among skeptics like people like Paul Hoke and others that said, well, good, Vincent Gwynn is a world authority on neutron activation analysis. If all the fragments trace the 2 bullets that were fired from Oswald's rifle, that's it, folks. That always struck me as rubbish. And so in the early 2000s, all of a sudden, neutron activation analysis, which had been used to put a lot of people behind bars, incidentally, because they would round up their neutron activation analysis expert, Vincent Gwynn, and the FBI would trot him around to various trials where people were being accused, and he would do NAA tests and say, yep, this guy shot him, and these bullet fragments come from that bullet. Well, a guy named Eric Randage, then working for, now retired, from Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, apparently was brought in on one of these cases and he was a neutron activation analysis expert at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. And he challenged Vincent Gwynn in a trial and ultimately got someone off a murder rap. And I happened to read about this and I thought, well, that's interesting. Challenges began being raised on neutron activation analysis. And ultimately the FBI gave up using neutron activation analysis, stopped using neutron activation analysis entirely. And so I thought, well, God, I wonder what they'd think about the JFK NAA evidence. So, Lawrence Livermore Laboratory is right across the bay from me, and I invited Eric Grandage and his associate, Pat Grant, both NAA guys. Pat Grant, by the way, who is involved here, was a graduate student with Vincent Gwynn at the University of California, Irvine, and did NAA work. And so they looked at it, and I had them come and give a presentation in San Francisco to a select group of people, and they basically said it's rubbish. Vincent Gwynn stuff is rubbish. They ultimately published an article in a peer-reviewed journal, basically calling it rubbish, and subsequent to that, other peer-review articles have come out pointing that that the neutron activation analysis evidence is complete rubbish and that Vincent Gwynn was wrong, okay? So the neutron activation analysis conclusions have been completely debunked. Yet if you Google up, and I've done it, you'll find Warren Commission defenders like Gerald Posner testifying as recently, and by the way, they published this stuff in the late 2007 or 2008, 2006. That's been completely debunked and also debunked by others as well, as I've said. And yet Gerald Posner was asked in I think a CNN interview, well, what about neutron activation analysis? And here he was, this is like 5 or 6 years ago, long after it had been completely debunked. And Posner said, well, listen, we know the facts about this. Neutron activation analysis proves that all the fragments traced to only 2 bullets and they came from Oswald's rifle. Well, it turns out that the lead that was tested for NAA could have come from any bullets, including bullets not even from Mannlicher-Carcano bullets. And so had they gotten that little fragment out of Connolly's thigh, it would not have proven even that the bullet came from a Mannlicher-Carcano shell. It would have been really of no value whatsoever. So that's a long answer, but it gets us into another part of the case, because as I've investigated this case, and I think as you've looked at it too, Jacob, every time you turn another page and look at some other conclusions, some other fact claimed by the government, it proves out that they're on shifting sands and they're often completely wrong. And additional investigations proven them to be wrong over and over and over again. Any other questions?
Yep. Now, this isn't a question, just a comment, but you might want to comment. If not, we'll just go on. So the doctors in Dallas came clean and stated that the blowout at the back of JFK's head was the size of an orange. You've seen the photo with a number of Dallas staff indicating that. Also, Malcolm Kilduff indicating an entrance hit at the hairline with his finger on the right side of JFK's forehead. Everything else indicates the phony story shaping the false story.
Yeah, no, I would say that's right. Now, we really get into the weeds on this, and this would be a long discussion in and of itself. But the point I would make, and the argument that I would make, is I think that what Dr. Boswell originally wrote on the night of the autopsy cannot be dismissed. There was a defect that went all the way to the back of the head. Whether there was a blowout back there or not is another question entirely. And my suspicion is that the defect went back there, and when they put Kennedy on the gurney and brought him into trauma room 1, where he was examined, his scalp had been blasted apart, because my own view, and that as elaborated upon with very credible evidence in Tink Thompson's new book, he was hit twice in the head. Hit from the right front at 313, which is eminently obvious to anyone who just looks at it. You're just watching the Zapruder film. He gets hit in the head. He goes immediately driven back to the left, and there's a huge explosion here. And I'll even develop a little bit about why that's so compellingly true, not only from the book, but this is stuff I gave Tink and stuff I've lectured about. But then there's probably a second shot that hits him at about 328, because even though he goes back to the left very rapidly after 313, he goes forward even more rapidly after 328, where we suspect that he was hit a second time in the head, and additional material starts pouring forth from his face. His head is already disrupted. So when he gets to Parkland and they look at him, his scalp falls back and he's got a defect that goes from here all the way back, and they see this defect back there. And the pathologist that's examining, the anesthesiologist that's sitting right at his head talks about some brain material at the very back of the head, cerebellum, sticking out of his head. So does the brain surgeon who's looking at him talks about cerebellum. So is cerebellum mentioned by 6 or 7 of the other doctors at Parkland. The defect was huge, going way to the back of his head. But that does not necessarily blow it back there. I think that the bullet that hit him here was a high velocity shell, a hunting round. Masad Ayub, for anybody that's into the weeds on guns and ammo, is an expert. And Masad Ayub, I can give people the quote if they ever want to have it. It's a delicious quote. He says, look, what we see in the Zapruder film is not what happens when a jacketed bullet hits a skull, particularly from that distance. He says, ask any hunter that's ever shot a deer if he's ever seen a head explode like that. He said, no. What that looks a lot more like is someone being hit with a high velocity round traveling 4,000 feet a second or so, and not a jacketed round, but a soft pointed hunting round. That's what causes an explosion of the skull like that. And you can't tell the direction of the bullet other than you can see the impact of the effect of the bullet, and that drives the head back to the left. It's the only thing that it.
Okay, Gary, if you can hear me, we lost you.
I think his mic is still working. Try his video again.
Here
he
is.
comes.
Okay, we lost you for a couple of minutes there, Gary. You're muted though.
No, it appears he's not muted. Can you hear us, Gary? Not if you can hear us. Yeah, Gary, we cannot hear you.
Why don't you give him a call?
All right.
Can you hear me, Gary? Not if you can hear me. Yeah, we can't hear you.
Jacob, I'm having him leave right now and try and log back in.
Okay. Bart, what time did we initially log on? And was it 5 till?
Yes.
Okay, so we should wrap up at about quarter till, don't you think? Or maybe 50 after? Maybe 9:50. We may be wrapping up earlier. Excuse me.
Shooting.
Okay, I think we
Can
got
you hear
you
me
back.
now?
Yeah, yeah.
Perfect. Okay, we're good.
Okay, did you want to finish answering that or did you want to go to the next question?
Well, I went on and on about neutron activation analysis and that it's junk science and you can, if you want to read about the evidence for it, it's on something else I wrote that's online. Just neutron activation analysis, Gary Aguilar, and you'll find it. And again, with all I have links to the original published articles in the peer review literature. But I'm just see the facts don't matter here because you'll have mainstream media. You'll have the mainstream media featuring somebody like Gerald Posner will say, "Oh yeah, neutron activation analysis proves there were only 2 shots. They both came from Oswald's rifle. We know that," and they'll never challenge them that. They'll never check peer-reviewed literature. And so, who are you going to trust? You can trust people who are defending the government, or people who have no opinion on the Kennedy assassination. That's the 2 guys from the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. They are completely agnostic on the question of conspiracy, but they are experts on NAA. Say yes, the NAA in the Kennedy case doesn't is no proof whatsoever that Oswald's bullets did it. Those fragments could have come from any kind of a bullet, not necessarily medical or Arcano bullets.
Okay, we got lots of questions. We have 20 more minutes.
Okay, good. All right.
Thanks for your interesting presentation. Can you give your succinct opinion as to the total number of bullets, particularly how many struck JFK, where, and what from what direction?
I would like to believe, I'd like to argue that Kennedy was hit in the front, but that would mean the bullet had to have gone through his windshield. And if it had, it would have blown out a hole in his back. I don't think it did that. And so just from a forensic standpoint, I think a bullet came through from behind and did hit him in the back and come out his throat. It's a weird thing why it didn't hit his vertebral body, but it did break the first transverse process of the first sort of cervical, the first thoracic vertebra. So I do think that happened. Do I think that that's the same bullet that hit Connolly? Probably not. I think that he was hit twice in the head. I think that the big one that hits him in the head hits him in the right front, drives him back to the left. I think it was a non-jacketed bullet that did it. and the non-jacketed bullet, immediately upon striking non-jacketed, they impart an enormous amount of momentum. All the skull shooting tests that were done by the government on human skulls show, even with a medical kind of bullet, it drives the skulls forward at a rate that's as fast as Kennedy's head was moving back to the left. But if you hit it with a non-jacketed bullet, which flattens on impact, it would provide even more momentum to the skull. Now, there's medical evidence to suggest that too. And this goes right back to the Clark panel. The Clark panelist, the radiologist, describes what I've seen myself and what the other doctors who've seen this. And there's a cloud of tiny little fragments, microscopic, minuscule little fragments. And where are they? The right front part of the head. And minuscule fragments have a lot of drag in tissue. They're so small and their mass is so small, and their surface area relative to their mass is so small, they don't move far from where they're first deposited. And where is that cloud of fragments? Right where they were hit here. And it's called a snow trail. And the snow trail will tell you where a non-jacketed bullet has hit a skull, because it leaves that snow trail where it hits. And that's where the snow trail is. That's where that cloud of fragments is. So there's radiological evidence. And of course, the lunge back to the left, without going into lots of detail here about why neuromuscular reaction doesn't work, but that's complete rubbish too. And you can find that on essays I've written. But the X-ray supported, the acoustic supports it, and his lunge back to the left supports it. So I think he was hit there. And then he bounces off the back seat, starts going forward, and then after 328, he's hit a second time in the head at about 327, 328, and then his head starts moving forward. More material starts coming out of his face. And there happens to be another perfect acoustic fingerprint for a shot at that time. So I think he was hit twice in the head and once in the back, and it emerged through his throat.
Okay, this doesn't directly relate to the medical, but since you'd commented on it, he says, could you comment on the relationship between Zapruder, Time Life, Henry Luce, Claire Booth Luce, William Harvey, CIA guy, and Alan Dulles, director of the CIA? What was Alan Dulles doing at the CIA forum on November 22nd? That's a separate question.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting into areas that I don't know about in any great detail.
Well, don't feel like you need to.
The only thing I'll say is that Alan Dulles was the most active member on the Warren Commission. He was fired by Jack Kennedy in the wake of the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and he hated the Kennedys. And for him to, and when he first showed up for the Warren report, he passed out a book talking about lone gunmen, and passed around to all the members of the Warren Commission that he was pretty convinced that that's what they were going to find, that this is another lone nut gunman. And I think that he was extremely influential on the Warren Commission, and he had lots of skeletons to hide, including the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald had been a radar operator at Atsugi Naval Base, which was the CIA base from which U planes flew across Russia. Lee Harvey Oswald knew knew that planes were being dispatched from there, knew that the altitudes they could fly at, knew that they were being dispatched across Russia. And then when he defects to Russia, he goes in the American embassy and promises that he's going to turn over state secrets to the Russians, which as a radar operator at a U-2 spy base, he might have some information about. He's in Russia for 22 months. He returns to the United States at the height of the Cold War, and he's not arrested for treason.
Yeah.
Who's he working for? Well, Alan Dulles would not have wanted an exploration of that question, put it that way, and nor did he get one. Another question?
Right. Yeah. Was the back wound caused by a bullet that ricocheted off the street traveling upward? And do you think the throat wound was a bullet or a glass fragment from the windshield? I think you answered the second one already.
Yeah, the thing is, if the bullet entered from the front, these are all remote possibilities. But the problem is, he did have his arms up. He was struck by something. Where did that bullet go? and that's the question you have to ask yourself. Where did the bullet go? If it struck him in the back, if it struck him in front and went through, it would have left a bigger gaping hole in the back, and it would have been lodged in the back of the limousine, in the seat of the limousine. So I don't think it came from the front to the back. So if it went from the back to the front, do I think that it some people said, yeah, a bullet bounced off and it seemed to be traveling upward when it hit him. It may have originated from a lower position than Oswald's perch, but I think that a bullet did hit him from behind. And as you said, as I showed from the abrasion collar, which is most noticeable toward the lower part of the wound, it appears that it was traveling somewhat upward, although probably not all that upward when it hit him. But if it entered there, the bullet, if it had bounced off the asphalt, what a miracle that it hit him right there. And I can't believe that it would have. And then why would he have reached for his throat if he was hit in the back? In any case, these are all questions I'm sure we're never going to have perfect answers to, and they're always going to remain mysteries as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, next one. Regarding your comment about the Katzenbach memo in the Q&A about if there was a conspiracy, then Hoover missed it. Isn't that at odds with Hoover telling Johnson that it seems someone else was using Oswald's identity in Mexico City?
Oh yeah, this gets into a very interesting discussion. 6 weeks before the assassination, there's someone in Mexico impersonating Oswald in telephone calls to the Russian embassy. And Hoover knew that there was something very ugly going on. But remember, Hoover was a compromised guy himself, and the agency, the CIA, probably had, and most people think that the CIA had compromising photographs of him in flagrante delicto with another man, and they may have come to him and said, "Hey, you would not want this to get out," and basically compromised him. Plus, Oswald himself was probably providing information for the FBI itself, and there was compromise going around. And I think that Oswald, pinning it on Oswald and then eliminating Oswald, burying the story was what had to happen. The Katzenbach memo hints at how powers were being arrayed to do that. I think there's no question but that everyone was compromised in this. And it takes us just to the nature of official investigations. The fix is all, the minute you appoint an official investigatory body, the fix is in. You already know what the conclusion is going to be. Just a matter of getting people with the highest credentials in the world, Nobel Prize laureates, to basically sign on.
Okay, some people are questioning your point that the bullet wound in the neck was not an entry wound from the front, and a couple of people are saying, well, if it went through the windshield, or it could have been a low velocity type gun, that the bullet would have remained in the body rather than exiting the rear and hitting the
right. Well,
seat.
that's okay. That's always the question we've asked. And, my response to that is, if it had enough power to actually hit him, it would have been driven inside the body. If it stopped inside the body, I've seen the original x-rays. It's not on any of the x-rays anywhere. And bullets show up very brightly on an x-ray film. As you can see if you see the anterior posterior x-ray that's available on the web, there's that 6.5 millimeter object, who knows what it is.
Well,
but,
they're talking about the neck wound. Though.
The neck wound, but I'm saying, I've seen the neck, I've seen the original x-rays, and everybody that's looked at the original x-rays of the neck and the chest and the head, there's no bullet in there.
Okay. Let's see. You're getting hit on this one. Didn't the report written by Seibert and O'Neill say that the back wound was a downward trajectory?
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. At 45-degree angle, because that's what they heard Dr. Hume say. Now, again, Hume's, God love him, I think that he was probably a good anatomic pathologist. He was not a forensic pathologist. So what does he do? He sticks his finger in the wound, and he wore, apparently, people I know who knew him told me he wore an 8.5 glove. He had big hands, and he stings his finger in the wound, which any forensic pathologist in the world will tell you that's not what you do. And he thought there was a downward track. And so that's what Seibert and O'Neill reported, because that's what they heard Hume suggest, that it seemed to be going down. But again, that's not the evidence you get from Humes about the forensics in this case is totally worthless. Unfortunately, he's not a forensic pathologist. By the time, as I said, Dr. Fink, who had some forensic credentials, although he wasn't the guy that this case called for, because he wasn't doing autopsies himself, he was just reviewing the work other people had done, just kind of a paper reviewer. He got there half an hour. They'd already gotten the brain out. They'd already manipulated the body. So the problem is, you can't really be sure what that wound looked like, other than the fact that there seemed to be a downward angle by Hume sticking his finger in it, which is not the way to probe it. What you do is you get these very fine, firm rods, and you very gently probe it to see where the wound, the track wants to fall. And then sometimes you can get it, but a lot of times even then you can't get it. Ask Cyril Wecht, ask any other forensic pathologist. And the reason you can't is a bullet goes through, and in the meantime, Kennedy's arm is up like this, and all of a sudden now he's on the autopsy table, and he's been turned, and this, that, and the other thing, and all the muscles shift around the entrance wound, the bullet wound, and you may or may not have an accurate account of where it went. It's unfortunately not the diagnostic thing you'd like it to be.
Okay, well, we only got 3 more minutes, so there's no point in taking another question. So let me just say thank you very much, Gary. It's been absolutely excellent. We're honored and appreciative.
Listen, I invite you to put my email address out if you'd like, and if people have some other specific questions. But again, the essay that I spoke to tonight is available online with all hot links to original source documents, and people are welcome to see them and review them. And neutron activation analysis, that's another thing that keeps coming up again. Lucian Haig, does not want to read what the original literature says about this. He wants to cite Larry Sturtevant as a quote expert on neutron activation analysis, and he doesn't know anything about this subject. But these are the grand poo experts that the mainstream media will always turn to for the truth about what happened to Jack Kennedy.
All right, now what's the actual title of the article, the 5 investigations article?
Oh, how 5 investigations into JFK's medical autopsy evidence got it wrong. But all you have to do is put Aguilar, Aguilar, and how 5 investigations up in a Google search, and bam, it'll take you right there.
And I cannot recommend that article highly enough. I mean,
okay, well, thank you. That's so nice of you.
Yeah.
That's so nice of you. It was a labor of love at the time. And there's more stuff I could have added to it if I were writing it today based on other stuff that's come out, but it still is a pretty good primer on how things go wrong. And how the government basically, and the media will always push the official narrative.
Yeah, and how the public, certain parts of the public want to believe what they want to believe, regardless of the evidence in front of them.
Exactly.
So, all right. Well, next week we go with Doug Horn. We return now to the national security state and the Kennedy assassination, the Cold War context of the assassination. We wrap it up with me, and then we follow with a panel on the national security state and the assassination. Thanks for tuning in, and thank you again, Gary, and we'll see you all next week.
Thank you so much. Thanks, and thanks for this great opportunity. Wonderful. Appreciate it.
Great.